We interrupt this incredibly awesome music to bring you some incredibly awesome political talk on Damn Radio.
Hello, good evening, welcome. I am Samuel Trapp. This is International Flavor. Very glad to have you this evening. And today there's, plenty of information to go through. Probably too much to go through and no, overbearing topic. I had another bit of opportunity to, by the way, if anybody wishes to know, I'm coming to you live from the Lake Ozark Real Estate of the Art Studio. You can call in if you'd like, 573-746-8020. You can send emails to live@damnradio.com. And we can proceed from there. So, I've been following for a few days now, probably a week now, the talks about underground nuclear testing, because it does get me, it's something that's of interest to me, having been in that area of the world before, or that profession. And watching, I finally got a chance to watch all of the Večer sa Solovjovom, Evening with Solovjov, and where they talk about some of these things, and it seemed to be and I only watched, generally I only have time to watch it once a week, and so I try to watch the Sunday one that comes out, because I just like the Sunday one. And so they were talking about the Khabarovsk, the Poseidon, the Sarmat, and these are all nuclear platforms for nuclear weapons from the Russian side. And so they're all talking about these things. And so I don't want to talk about the politics of it all. I don't suppose the politics of it all really matter. If it happens, it happens. If we start underground testing, they're going to start underground testing. Yeah, I find it foolish. They said they won't be doing testing unless we start, but let's talk about Russia's rolling out the carrier for the Poseidon, the unmanned underwater system that goes where missile systems cannot, where missile defense doesn't. And so out of the studio, the Khabarovsk joins the Belgorod on the Pacific, and what they can do is they can alternate patrols. So one of them is always at Xi'an on land. They have the Sarmat, which is a heavy ICBM that is meant to replace the Voyevodka, which goes from experimental duty towards, full regimen of operational capabilities. So if you're looking for truth and not just propaganda, they're talking about survivability, staying power, everyone else, and the bluffing that, appears to be going on from our side of the world. So even if we got ready to start nuclear testing again, which has nothing to do with being nuclear capable, it's just underground nuclear testing, we could start testing some intermediate range, long range, other sorts of weapons delivery systems. I suppose you don't really have to test any nuclear explosions underground. That makes sense to me. We all know what's going to happen if you blow them up. We've seen it nearly 1,000 times in the desert west of Las Vegas. It's unfortunately somewhat depressing. So, but Russia did the same thing, and they quit a little bit before we did. And but what now they're talking about is they have been developing alternate delivery systems. Now, I really intend to, and I haven't yet, but I got to thinking about it today, about going in further into the U.S. side and see what delivery systems that we have and compare our abilities straight up to the Russian abilities that I do know a fair amount about, right? So the practical headline of it all is according to what was being passed out on Solovyov, they were saying that both the Khabarovsk and the Belgorod will be Pacific-based. And so one boat can be in port and the other one can be out in patrol. So they would have continuous coverage. So you don't need to love or hate Moscow or believe or disbelieve propaganda from either side to know that that's logical. When one is tied in at port, the other one is out. And if that's deterrence, that's deterrence. That's exactly what defines deterrence, is constant capability to have a nuclear presence. So the Poseidon is the system that the boats are built to carry. So it's not a strategic, it's not the old style strategic ballistic missile. It rides in the ocean's blind spots, under ballistic missile radar horizon, outside the anti-aircraft playbook. So whether you think Poseidon is overhyped, whether you think it's a terror weapon or an easy way for the Russians to bypass missile defense, the strategic idea is obvious. You destroy the adversary's confidence in a risk-free first strike. Because remember, these are loitering munitions that can hover. They have nuclear technology able to stay in place for a long time with a nuclear engine, a nuclear power source. And I don't mean a nuclear bomb. That's a separate issue altogether, but nuclear power source. Okay? So if you can't be sure that you've killed the other guy's second strike force, which we talked about in the military, years ago all the time. And this was the Armageddon deterrent. Everybody knew that the other side, everybody would have time to, send out their answers in the strike forces, because it takes a while for the missiles to get there. But now, if they can come from satellites, if they can come through laser technologies, if your attack force is something different, well, now the question is whether or not you will be able to respond in kind. And the fact is that the Russians will be able to, even if they didn't have a first success. They have the strategic loitering forces that would be willing to reply. So it's a confidence destroyer, really, in first strike technologies. So you don't push the red button in the first place. So this is deterrence. This is a deterrence 30 years later, right? After the fall, and it's nuclear deterrent 101, college level. And it's written in the 1950s, still true after every, fashionable speech about, the ending of history. So the framing of these talks that listening to between these guys on Solovyov Live was that Khabarovsk is a new means that nobody else has, and it's in service now, not 10 years from now. It's not on a PowerPoint slide. It's not on a drawing board somewhere. It is like really in service. In the Belgorod, then you got a 2-boat rotation that's easy to communicate, hard to ignore. It doesn't require you to believe in any exotic super weapon. It requires you to admit that an undersea, unmanned, long-range, nuclear-capable system is a hard thing to preempt. And so it's uncertainty that they're after with you. So what hasn't happened in a long time is that adults have spoken to each other on a reasonable level. And even listening to Trump these days, everybody else is testing. We'll just start testing. Well, What happened to diplomacy? I've been saying this for at least a year. Where is diplomacy? When are we going to start talking like adults? When are we going to start discussing what we can do to make it a safer world? I'm not sure we ever are, to be truthful. And so I don't know. You don't design a Poseidon carrier to win a nuclear war. That isn't a thing anyway. Nobody wins in a nuclear war. You build it to lock in the worst case scenario for anybody who fantasizes about taking out a country in a first strike. That's why you do it. Anyone who tells you deterrence is an outdated concept hasn't done the math, or is, selling their own, memoirs, about remember when. I suppose I'm sort of doing that myself, but I'm saying the obvious. It hasn't changed. Deterrence hasn't changed remotely. And here we are, one-upping each other once again, and we're right back to it. What we ostensibly got rid of in the 90s isn't really gone, because we won, right? We all won the Cold War. And if we really had won the Cold War, we wouldn't be where we are right now. If we had treated the Russians like contemporaries, at least, instead of some third world country, we might be in a better position than we are right now. If we want for fewer nuclear weapons, which I say is a good thing to do, then fine. Negotiate, verify, codify, put in new treaties, put something else in place, but hoping that, deterrence is just going to stick around because people are reasonable is about as effective as, I don't know, hoping that your rent goes down because you said please. One more read on the Pacific-based part of this, that Russia is going to be in the Pacific. It complicates the targeting. A boat at sea can be anywhere from the Sea of Okhotsk to the mid-Pacific. That stretches the adversary's, America in this case, anti-submarine assets even before you get to the unmanned payloads, right? So you don't need to be a fan of any flag, U.S. or Russian, to see that this is insurance against or for in favor of a second strike, and not just talking about the first. So why don't we talk further about that? The Sarmat is the land leg of that on the Russian side, right? They said that Sarmat has been on the experimental drawing boards for a long time, and actually been on duty since about September of 2023. And a first launch was in April of 22 from Plesetsk, and that's they're slated to be fielded next year, replacing the R36 to 36M2 Voyevoda. That's the trifecta of schedule, near-term fielding, pedigree. If true, if what they're saying on this show is true, it means that the heaviest piece of the modernization triad is not an abstract plan, but a regimental-sized reality in the next budget year. So the Sarmat is a tactical nuclear weapon, and the strategic ones are the kind that are in your in your silos that come up, right? And then the other ones are your land-based, sea-based, air-based, right? Why does all of this matter? Because survivability isn't just about hiding; it's about absorbing, responding. A modern heavy ICBM, gives weight, range, and depending on the payload, flexibility against hardened or widely separated targets. In plain English, a refreshed silo force is one more reason nobody in their right mind launches first. Okay, so here we are again talking about nuclear weapons, and we haven't talked about this in how long? I mean, in 30 years. And here's a panel in Russia, seven political analysts talking about this. They're throwing out specifics that rather than a treaty document, they're talking about things pretty open, but this isn't in a treaty document. They're talking about 10 warheads at around 700 kilotons each, 7 megatons total, and a target of up to 50 missiles on duty when everything is said and done. They say that once Vojvoda is swapped out, the ground leg will be 100% new or new generation by the end of this decade. So, claims made in the air, maybe it's useful for debate, maybe it's not gospel, but I know that's what they're talking about, and I know the modernization direction isn't controversial. Russia is pushing out the old, and have been for a while, and they're escorting in new, and lots of it. And it's not just chest thumping. It's not just, my brother's bigger than yours. It's the U.S. Minuteman III. Let's take that as a comparison. There are routine test launches from Vandenberg in the, what's it called, those Quadrain test range, and underscores how old the Minuteman system core is despite upgrades. So it's a familiar message, but it's not wrong. America has stretched Minuteman well beyond its original life. And Russia highlights its rapid recapitalization since 2018. You can debate the tone. You can debate, whether this is reality or not. But this is actual. The U.S. is finally moving to the Sentinel ICBM, but the glide from promise to posture is years away. They're far, far away from modernizing the ICBM fleets. Or not fleet, the ICBM core. So Russia is saying that our glide path is much steeper because they started long ago. And so that is part of the deterrence. It's communications, right? So whenever you want to hear warhead counts and megaton math, put two realities in mind. One, strategic systems support multiple payload configurations. How many and how big is dependent upon doctrine, and they signal this as much as set it at a fixed number. So, two, arms control reporting and test telemetry give you a range of credible, scenarios, not a neat, package of what is, So, basically, what was discussed on the program that I watched is, as numbers being quoted, they're consistent with modernization patterns in the big picture. And I know they've been doing it for a while because it's not just this one show. This is a continual discussion over a longer period of time. So what does regiment getting Sarmat mean in practice? So basically it puts a refreshed tactical throw weight in central Russia, and it layers it among, other divisions. It complicates targeting problems for NATO in the West, certainly in Ukraine. But the doctrine isn't changed. It's the ground leg is the historical backbone of the triad. Making it all new by 2030 is definitely an internal coherent goal. And you don't have to like that to understand it, right? So then the show they had a few targets on this. Like they took a swing at Western leaders who just like to tell voters that Russia is bluffing, and they note that NATO brands itself accurately as a nuclear alliance. And insists that Europeans, we know this to be true anyway. Europeans mostly mean Americans when they say, they can respond in kind. In other words, the politics is pretty loud and clear, but the hard power is definitely concentrated only in America. And you can disagree with that, but you shouldn't, because it's really true. The nuclear power isn't in Europe. Well, it is, but it's America's power, and that's where it is. When Dutch and other European leaders tell their voters that we shouldn't fear Russia's nuclear threats, the audience hears, oh, gee, we're all safe, but the what they're really hearing is call to U.S. routine that's been going on since 1949. Deterrence depends on both sides believing the other is serious. And that the U.S. will back up Europe. So the second you talk like it's a theater, a discussion, then you reduce what deterrence really mean. That's why saying it's a bluff is just stupidity, and a dummy politics. If you think the other side is posturing, don't say it in a public sphere. Don't say it as if it's just a bluff. You have to keep your force survivable, hold your doctrine steady, improve your kill chains. We don't have those, or we haven't been modernizing ours. That's a miscalculation on our side, and the Russians haven't been miscalculating. So the only way nuclear war will really start is in a world where nobody really wants it, but the posturing finally gets to a point where somebody's got to do something. And this is the part, this escalatory talking back and forth just drives me bananas, and I don't like it. And I would like to see some sane folks in the room. Now, admittedly, Solovyov, that's a political program. Those are people that are, selling the show just as much as they're selling the discussion. I like to listen to it. I think it's interesting. I think there's lots of truth in it, just like there is plenty of truth in some of the things that we listen to here. But that doesn't mean I have to like it. And so you listen to these people on both sides, including Trumpster, talk about nuclear threat and upping the ante. It's frustrating to me because it's something I thought we were, sorry, I'm de-jacketing here. You might hear that in the background. Suddenly it's warm in here. I don't know. Usually it's freaking freezing, but not this time. So let's talk about the undersea part of it in the Pacific, right? So if Pacific-based pattern is holding, one boat out, one boat in, Khabarovsk, Belgorod, watch for the operational signaling, port calls, satellite imagery, occasional state TV shot, crew rotations. Quiet subs are only quiet to the public. Professionals on both sides will know the patterns within months. So the aim is to make those patterns boring, predictably unpredictable. And the Sarmat, if you look at the milestone, that's an easy headline, but the bigger story is the rate at which they are being exchanged out. If one regiment doesn't change their strategic balance, replacing an entire silo cohort over a few years does. If the up to 50 figure that they were talking about on the show is even close, the question is training pipelines, maintenance capacity, silo hardening. If schedules slip, it'll show up first in how often officials do not talk about it. If the schedule holds, it'll show up in how quickly the rhetoric gets boring. That's how you know the system is real. It stops being exciting. So expect more. We are a nuclear alliance talk out of NATO capitals. That line is partly about shoring up their domestic nerves with U.S. backing, partly about reminding Moscow that the U.S. is a member of this Article 5 defense, and it's smart politics to keep that. Watch the adjectives that they give out on this, right? And pay attention to that. So the punchline is, minus the drum roll, continuous undersea patrols that carry a hard to preempt second stripe option, heavy ICBMs moving from experimental to regimental reality, and a Western chorus reassuring its voters that no, we're not scared at all. Everyone is performing, but the hardware isn't just theater. If you want a safer world, you need fewer of these weapons and greater rules surrounding them, more treaties surrounding them. And we don't have that. There's not even an effort at that right now, which I think is a travesty, and I think is depressing, and I think it's sad that everything that we worked for in the 90s and before, completely gone. And in fact, here we are again. You know, what goes around comes around. Here we are back to the same old crap that we've been living in since World War II, and probably before that too. But my history is more, you know, only goes back about 50 to 70 years. You know, it's disgusting. So until you get some kind of discussion, some kind of, I don't know what, diplomacy between Rubio and Lavrov to start with, and then include some of these things and get people talking like we did years ago with our biggest enemy. We talked all the time. You know, we were talking with our enemies. We spoke together. We talked about things we could talk about. You didn't agree on everything, but the things you agreed upon weren't a big deal. Nowadays, if you don't like talking to someone, you can't agree upon anything, right? You're not allowed to agree about anything if you don't like the source, right? You're supposed to, if so-and-so doesn't like, I don't know what, gay marriage, every gay person has to hate that guy, and he has to hate all gay people. It's friggin' nonsense. It makes no sense at all. Nuclear reductions don't have to be pretty. You know, deterrence is friggin' ugly, right? It's why things haven't changed. It's why worse things haven't yet happened. You know, but don't romanticize it. Don't trivialize it. Just understand it well enough that adults have to be in charge, and not just people that want to one up the other guys. You know, it's one up the other side. I don't know, this 700 kiloton talk. This this was a November 11 discussion on Pacific basing, one at sea rotation, Sarmat experimentation, and the regiments of this year. This is reality that they're talking about in multiple sources. So this is not a joke. I want to lean into a little bit. We talked a little bit about it last night, and I've had a little bit of time to go further into it on what's really driving reality, on Europe's energy reality. Who's driving the train and who's riding along, right? So let's look at this complicated backstory. Under Trump, that the war wouldn't have happened. Europe's hard line on Moscow is Washington's pressure campaign. Viktor Orban of Hungary has been the loudest megaphone on both sides of this issue. But now with a new twist. He has exemptions that allow him to keep buying Russian energy while everybody else gets to talk sanctions and, morality. Oh, geez, we can't. These Russians have attacked. Yeah, it was all the Russians and nothing having to do with NATO. NATO expanding to their border with the assistance of Ukraine and making Ukraine the bad guy for it, right? Let's go to the narrative against the fact of Europe that Europeans live on. Oil, gas, pipelines, LNG, price caps, politics. Lots and lots of politics, right? So Orban came to Washington, and he pretty much instantly came out loud and said what plenty of people were not saying, and that plenty of people will not say. I say it all the time. And he said it. He's been pretty blatant about it for a while. Ukrainian victory will take a miracle, basically. That there's no way short of a miracle that Ukraine wins the war that is going on right now. Okay? U.S. and Hungary are the only pro-peace governments in the Western side, the only two. Europe is hardening its stance because America is leaning on Europe. And the new headline out of the meeting isn't rhetoric. It's an exemption that lets Hungary keep buying oil from sanctioned Russian energy firms. Now think about that. If Budapest is boasting that this waiver is indefinite, that's not symbolism. That's oil in the pipeline and money changing hands. Trump's line hasn't changed since 2022. This wouldn't have happened. This war wouldn't have happened if I were president. Joe Biden's war, blah, blah, blah. He said it then. He says it now. Of course, now I disagree, and I think it's his war now. But whether you agree or disagree doesn't matter. It's a counterfactual, unprovable by definition, and hotly disputed by analysts and fact checkers who note he often couples his fact that this war never would happen with the fact that he says, I gave him these weapons. Obama gave him, I don't know, sleeping bags, and I gave him weapons, remember? That they talk about. Now, I'm not saying that this was, I tend to believe that while Trump was in office, this war might not have happened. I think it's more likely than not that it wouldn't have, but I'm worried about what I'm watching right now in South America. I'm worried about that. And because Trump, Mr. Peace plan, is pushing hard. And he got 10,000 troops down there, various types. I'm not so sure I like that. That doesn't necessarily scream peace, does it? So let's talk about this oil story, though. These aren't just slogans. Let's separate what Europe says from what Europe actually does. So, seaborne Russian oil. The EU banned import of crude December 5th, 2022, and refined products February 5th, 2023. That's real. Okay, that's on seaborne. They banned them. But the pipelines, the southern Drushba line, was exempted from those banning. Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic could keep taking Russian crude. That was the deal then. It's still reality now. And it's why Budapest cares so much about those waivers, right? Let's talk about diesel. Europe used to rely on Russian diesel, even post-ban, but trade flows were redrawn and rerouted. But by 2024, Russia's diesel share in Europe, which used to be about 50%, is less than 5%. So the translation of that, the product is coming from somewhere else. The Middle East, India, the U.S., with some back channels via refined from Russian crude outside of the EU, which is now explicitly being targeted by Brussels, and that comes from S&P. So when Orban tells Trump that landlocked Hungary needs Russian oil, he's not making it up. The refineries are optimized for a Urals blend, and switching grades isn't like swapping soda flavors. During the late August, the Drushba disruption, Hungary and Slovakia refineries rode their inventories and found alternate routes. It worked briefly, but it underlined the risk of where it is. Since that means they had to ask for this waiver. They had to get it. So the competing view to that is that European think tanks argue that the loopholes should have closed faster. U.S. secondary sanctions and EU measures together to squeeze remaining Russian oil flows and any backdoor products refined elsewhere. This is predictable. Energy security 101, don't pull the plug, which they did, before you've built a replacement, which they didn't. And so that was the problem with diesel, right? And that has created problems for them of astronomical, and that's why Orban had to ask Trump for this exemption, right? So now let's talk about gas and liquid natural gas. This is an extremely slow divorce for Europe from Russian. The pipeline gas is where Europe moved the fastest because Moscow forced the issue by strangling its own flow in 2022. Those numbers are not in dispute. Russia's share of EU pipeline gas fell from 40% in 2021 to roughly 11% in 2024. So counting the pipeline plus liquid natural gas, Russia was less than 19% of EU gas imports in 2024. That's a pretty structural shift in the heating season, right? Eurostat confirms this trend. Natural gas in gaseous form from Russia is down from 48% quarter one of 2021 to 12% in quarter two of 2025. And Norway and LNG took up the slack from there. But here's the part that the critics just love. Russian liquid natural gas. While pipeline gas collapsed, EU LNG purchases from Russia, liquid natural gas, actually hit record highs in 2024. Mainly Yamal cargoes landing in France and Belgium, sometimes for transshipment. So the optics were horrible. And they're trying to change it now. In October, the EU adopted a phased LNG ban, ending short-term deals in 6-month and long-term contracts by January 2027. Energy ministers back off a full ban on Russian gas by 2028. So that's a slow, drawn-out process, but they're saying, here's what we're not going to do. So the hawks all say that that's too slow. The industry says, no, that's actually too fast because you don't have a replacement and you can't change the type that's in the system. Not that fast. So the policy compromise is a long run way to avoid a repeat of 2022 price spikes in infrastructure, interconnectors, storage. Got to get everything fully in place, right? So the question becomes then: is Europe just following Washington in this? I'm not so sure about this, and I don't know that I know the answer to this myself. I tend to think that they are. But Orban is saying that the EU's toughness is really U.S. pressure under the EU flag. So there's overlap. Washington and Brussels have joined together on oil bans, caps, financial sanctions, sometimes in lockstep, sometimes off a bit. Analysts note that using a U.S. sanctions outside of the U.S. amplifies EU measures, especially in oil and shipping of oil. That's the leverage that Orban has been resisting, and exactly what EU strategists want more of to choke remaining flow. So the EU has been blaming the U.S. for not being as strict as they could have been. And so Orban going to get an exemption from Trump actually usurps all of that. But the EU has its own energy security reasons for worrying about this too. Russian supply cuts since 2006 and the 2021-2022 squeeze and the Nord Stream sabotage drama convinced, most of the European capitals that dependence upon Russia is a loaded gun, sitting on the table. So the EU Council and the Commission language today, where they're saying they need to end Russian gas by 2028, is framed as their own sovereignty. But if you take a competing view, if the U.S. stepped back, Europe could and should field enough capability, both militarily and energy-wise, to manage Russia alone, right? The Cato Institute, from a different angle, argues that Europe must stand on its own feet. And by 2030, they say that it can if it has the political will. And those aren't Moscow's talking points, of course. Those are Western policy circles talking about getting away from permanent dependency upon Russia. So Russia is definitely seeking other customers, let's say, which is why it's so important what Trump says he's going to, have a deal here with Modi before too long, and there's other things going on. I got a story on that bit here in a little bit on small and medium enterprises between Russia and China and what they're doing, and I hope to get to that story here today. But let's talk about the it wouldn't have happened part, the Trump thing. So what's the cleanest way to handle Trump's claim? Say what it is and what it isn't. It's a counterfact. He has said it since February of 2022. And counterfacts are politics, not proof. It isn't a settled truth on top of that. Fact checkers and analysts repeatedly push back, saying that he also mixes in history about how the 2022 increase in hostilities unfolded. The Lowy Institute's take, even if Trump wants a quick end, the war's logic and his image management could pull him in opposite directions. We've been seeing that since he took office this year. And that is unfortunate, but true. I think he does want this war to go away. I think he wants to, because he's always saying it, that this really isn't my war. I think it is now, was my point of view. But Orban insists that there's no question the war wouldn't have happened under Trump. But I say that he's saying that, or said it here in particular, in an effort to get, to yank the chain of the old Trumpster, to get the relief, the exemption that he was seeking. Now, that's my own personal belief. That's not evidence, of course, but voters get to say, the strength and deterrence and all of that of the old Trumpster. Really, it wasn't going to be his. It wasn't his war. I happen to agree with that. I really do. But whether Orban believes in that or not, I don't know. Orban says it, but I think it's convenient to say it when you're here asking for an exemption so you can keep your Russian pipelines flowing, right? Let's talk about price caps, revenues, and sanctions, and all of that. So this is a theological debate. What do we know about this? Modeling says a tougher cap, $30 a barrel, would have shaved Russian revenues by 40% since 2022. I forget what the cap is. They put it on, I think it was $45 a barrel. But if they'd have put it down to 30, that would have, squeezed them even more. But the argument is behind tightening enforcement and closing shipping loopholes. But Brussels now is explicitly trying to block backdoor refined products made from Russian crude outside the EU to close off one of these messy sanctions don't work things. Skeptics say caps are leaky and raise global shipping and insurance risk without ending the war. Obviously, it's not ending the war. And I don't think any of this is going to end the war. So it's just incrementalism. Leaks get patched, trade routes adapt, and revenues continue. They might go down a little bit, but it's a cumulative game. It's not a knockout punch to say, oh, gee, you can't buy Russian oil, especially when China's buying the bulk of it, or other places that the U.S. cannot control. You don't have to like Orban to understand his math, is the short story. The IMF data cited by Reuters in 2024, Hungary bought 74% of its gas and 86% of its oil from Russia. Budapest argues that an EU-wide natural gas cutoff would knock 4% off of its GDP. In a small landlocked economy with older refineries tuned to Ural crude, that isn't posturing. That's like reality. That's budgets. That's unemployment. So the waiver had to be pursued, and it's and getting that waiver gave Orban a definite domestic political payoff, right? What has been happening is markets can shift more crude to non-Russian grades over time if pipeline capacity from Croatia's Adriatic route is expanded, but over time, it doesn't mean tomorrow. And most of this is replaceable if Drushba dries up. That's a big freaking if. And so Washington gave the waiver on the Russian gas, oil and crude, because it needed to. So I'm not so sure if, this is it's plain that Orban got what he wanted, right? He got space to keep Russian barrels flowing. He gets to play peacemaker. Europe isn't a U.S. puppet, it turns out, with its own security memory and its own timetables. But U.S. sanctions do matter, and Brussels use them when it suits them, but most of the time they don't bother. So saying it wouldn't have happened or would have happened doesn't really matter in this sphere, is what I'm saying. And Europe is weaning itself off Russian energy messily, imperfectively, and slower than Twitter would like you to believe. Hungary is the exception that is turning out to be the rule. Dependence gives you some leverage. If you don't like that, build more pipes. The terminals, the storage, generating capacity that makes waivers unnecessary. But until that time, politics has to follow where the barrel leads, I believe. I wanted to get into a couple of stories from the war front. Let's go to, I wanted to get to, because there was a story today about 25 surrender victims in Pokrovsk. Let's get a look at this if we can. Let's see here. Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad is where we are going to go. Let's see. If you want to know how war is going, stop listening at the political podiums and start watching what's going on in the logistics. That's why I watch every day these, not every day, but several times a week, these mappers. Especially in Myrnohrad, Pokrovsk region, the Soviet air names for those places were Dimitrov and Krasnoarmeysk. And the math is turning pretty freaking brutal. Russian electronic warfare today found a Ukrainian Marine detachment near Myrnohrad. Their drones did convincing flights over, and according to multiple Russian reports with videos, which I watched, 25-ish men from Ukraine's 38th Marine Brigade laid down their weapons and chose to live. Western outlets aren't paying attention to that hardly at all. They certainly haven't verified the exact head count yet. Nobody wants to talk about this. But the pattern is pretty clear. When you're cut off, low on batteries, food, and ammunition, the front line is a trap. It's not a post. So let's situate the map. Myrnohrad, Dimitrov, sits just east of Pokrovsk, Krasnoarmeysk. It's not just another dot on the map. It's the eastern hinge of the defensive belt Kiev has tried to keep intact so Pokrovsk doesn't collapse from the flanks. even Western wires are now conceding that Russia has enveloped Myrnohrad and from most of the sides and is grinding through Pokrovsk block by block. Kiev denies this encirclement, but language has shifted from stabilized to difficult and fluid, exactly the type of weaselly words you want to hear when there are no supply routes and people are dying. The propaganda war is pretty noisy, as usual, but the footage is pretty loud. Russian troops moving through the fog in what Western outlets dub Mad Max-style visuals, open-top vehicles, stripped doors, and assaults that look improvised but keep on coming. Reuters verified clips and broadcast packages now show exactly the kind of dirty urban fighting that chews through infantry, with Russia pushing a pincer move while Ukraine throws in so-called elite units to hold its shrinking perimeter. Al Jazeera, not exactly a Kremlin mouthpiece by any measure, asks whether the fall of Pokrovsk is a matter of time. And I say it is and has been for a little while. But when Al Jazeera writes that headline, that isn't Russian spin, okay? That's a real story. So back to the surrender. Several Russian outlets report that 25 Marines from the 38th Brigade capitulated near Myrnohrad Dmitrov. Some saying that's the largest single surrender since Mariupol. Lenta and URARU point to a video posted by war correspondents. VZRU attributes confirmation to the DPR militia channel, now folded into Russia's First Army Corps. Could this number be inflated? Always possible, but I watched the video. It looks like it looks accurate to me. But even cautious Russian analysts over the weekend said that isolated surrenders starting in this exact pocket that just keep getting larger and larger. And the operational tell, you don't get clusters of surrender unless command has lost control of resupply and extraction, which is what my military summary guy has been saying for a week plus, 10 days maybe. You know, that's logistics. You know, it's just logistics. Ukrainian channels are using their own video. You know, they won't pay any attention to any sort of Russian video. They put their own video. Strike videos from the same 38th Brigade showing drones hitting Russian fortifications in Myrnohrad's outskirts last month, and Navy aerials showing the town pounded into rubble, not a building left intact. These aren't staged audio reels, but they are old, and they're the familiar misery of industrial firepower. They support the core point that both sides are fighting hard, but the ground around Myrnohrad is becoming unlivable, and especially for units that can't be rotated out, fed, or rearmed. That's the entire Ukraine grouping that is there. So what do the West's most Ukraine-sympathetic trackers say about all this? The Institute for the Study of War, hardly Moscow-friendly also, notes that Russian routes into Myrnohrad and ongoing advances towards southern Pokrovsk are a reality. Institute of War language is careful, but interdicting logistics is strategist talk for the beginning of the end, right? This is it. Reuters' line for a week has been pretty consistent. Russia is going house to house and tightening the noose. Ukrainians acknowledge a difficult position, vow that there's no full encirclement, but I believe there is. They've been showing the same thing forever. Russia has asked people to go and check it out. Angelina Jolie went over there, but not for this. You know, she wasn't going to go to this war-torn area, but she that's why she was over there. I could finish up on that story some more tonight, too. But the AP adds that Russia holds a large share of the city already, Both sides are fighting within some of the same buildings. This is late stage urban reduction, and Russia wants to get it done before real winter hits, and it's getting closer all the time. So is Pokrovsk doomed? Is it Russian already? Is it going to go back to be renamed? It's not inevitable, but strategic reality is ugly for Kiev. Russia has shifted to the constriction of the supply lines it excels at. Its drones are blinding and harassing. The electronic warfare is turning Ukrainian comms into nothing but noise. Their artillery, which is still quite strong, and plenty of artillery there, certainly outshines anything the Ukrainians have on their side. And so small unit infantry going forward after all of this chaos is far more regular from the Russian side. And so the second thing to look at is the corridor calculus, where it looks worse each day for Kiev. The longer Kiev stays inside these pulverized blocks, the more it bleeds the specialized troops it cannot replace. And so it might buy some time for them at a horrible exchange rate. Even non-aligned outlets say that Russia is nearing a full envelopment kilometers from the last usable lanes to get out. You can call that operational pause if you'd like, but the infantry would call it, we can't get out. And I believe that to be the case, that they can't get out. And I've been following this for a good long time. And what about the politics? Kiev insists that the situation is controlled because politically it has to. Morale at home and leverage abroad depend upon them politically stating that. Propaganda, you know. Multiple Western outlets already report that 200 to 300 Russian assault troops are inside the urban zone, and that number is growing. That number isn't decisive all by itself, but it's just growing and growing and growing. The question is whether Russia can keep their corridors open while collapsing Kiev's. And I think that's been the slow churn of the last, 6 months at least. And so the evidence points one way. Even Al Jazeera Daily concedes that momentum and flags show Myrnohrad as surrounded. That is not RT, that isn't TASS, that's Doha reading the same map you and I are reading. That's Al Jazeera. So let's talk about the 25 soldiers. Does it matter? Does it matter if the exact count is 23? I don't know. Does it matter if it's 27? Not really. What matters is that this kind of surrender is consistent with an attrition profile where your battalion headquarters can't move medics, can't move ammo, can't move food, can't move you if you're one of the soldiers in there. It also matters symbolically. The 38th is a Marine brigade that Kiev has showcased in its own media for successful drone attacks. Seeing a slice of that same unit walk out hands up is a propaganda hit that ripples through the news and through the front, especially a front where the defenders know there's no clean rear area to fall back to, because there isn't. They are surrounded. The final truth, said without varnish, if I'm telling you, this is what I believe. If Kiev can't reopen, and they've been trying to reopen a corridor into Myrnohrad and attempt to unglue Russia's Pokrovsk encirclement fast, more groups, you'll be seeing more of this in the next few days, in the next week. You'll see that these soldiers will engage in the same calculus that the 25-ish that surrendered did. Physics will beats the politics. That's why Russia keeps using the word cauldron. They say it's a cauldron. They've become masters of this all through the war. You hear about these cauldrons, and then they put a lid on them, and they leave no way for them to escape. And they end up dying or surrendering. And they've been saying this for a good long time. You don't have to like the source, coming from the Russian side, I mean, to accept how mathematics works. A cauldron is only propaganda if you can drive through it. But they can't. And they don't have any vehicles left to drive through it anyway. But so the politics and the reality says something different than the politics will say. That's what I would say. I wanted to go a little bit, and that's enough of the front line news right now, and it's pretty tough out there for them. I wanted to go a little bit further into these small and medium enterprises. So November 23 to 25th, there's going to be a kind of a conference, I guess you would call it, about small and medium enterprises between Russia and China. And so if you want to see where de-dollarization stops being a debate and starts looking like real paperwork, real transfers of money, and signed POs, skip the huge talks, the macro talks, and look at this city called Xi'an in China, and I hope I pronounced that right, later this month, from November 23 to 25. The city is going to host the 6th annual Russia-China Small Medium Enterprise Forum, backed by the Shaanxi, I can't say it right, provincial government, China's foreign ministry, and the Russian embassy. Plus, there will be a familiar ecosystem of business groups on both sides. The Russian-Chinese Committee of Friendship, Peace and Development, Opory Россия, Delovaya Россия, that's Business Russia, and Roscongress. That isn't a think tank panel, it's a business-to-business grouping that if you're serious about trade without a dollar, this is a big deal. So the focus is pretty practical. Organizers say that 500 to 1,000 business participants will go through this sector, these sectors, agriculture, real estate, investment, tourism, Russia-Chinese trade, matchmakers of business to business, and site visits to places where the deals actually take place. The dry port, the Yangling agricultural high-tech zone, and the BYD complex that has become one of the planet's most productive EV plants. In other words, the forum isn't selling geopolitics, it's selling ways to get shipments cleared and invoices paid without tripping over sanctions. Why this city? Because geography is driving the strategy. It's not just an ancient capital and Silk Road postcard city. It's China's largest inland dry port. It's a rail gateway that forms a massive share of China-EU container traffic. If you're trying to normalize non-dollar trade flow between Russia and China, you go where trains, customs, bonded warehouses already know how to engage. So this city fits that bill. The International Trade and Logistics Park and its dry port operations anchor create a corridor that Central Asia, and even Kazakhstan market as a time saver to Europe. That matters. You know, it's a big deal. I wanted to do a little bit of a sideline here. When I went to Kyrgyzstan 2 years ago, was that 2 years ago or 3? I think it was only 2 years ago. I spent probably 6 weeks over there. And 2 of that I spent in Bishkek, which is the capital of Kyrgyzstan. And actually, it was longer than that because I did like 10 days on the front end and 10 days on the back end. And then I spent 2 weeks in Uzbekistan, 2 weeks in Kazakhstan in between there. And one of my favorite places that I made sure to go to several times in Bishkek, and I loved walking around down there. It's a cool city, and there's plenty of new development going on. Tons of shopping, tons of purchasing, tons of new things. Well, there's an entire, I don't know what else to call it, a section of the city that's called Derdoy. And I don't know what that stands for, whatever the name is, I really don't know. It's not Russian that I'm aware of. But Derdoy is where containers, it's like, I don't know, hundreds of acres. I mean, it's huge. It's a whole section of the city that is all of these containers that get, and this place, there's no water, there's no ocean that you're going to get to. These are all coming by rail. And they come, these containers, and they swap them out on a regular basis. You have a big train yard nearby. And they open the containers, whether on the end or on the side. They have some that the sides lift up, and you can turn them you can put big poles underneath them, and you turn them into these little mini shops all day long. And then they close them up and lock them up at night, and everybody goes home, and, that's that. But these things are enormous sorts of flea markets, we would call them here, but this is a regular market. Instead of having a storefront, you got a container front. That would be really cool to do something like that here. And so they bring in all these goods from China, and they're all over Kyrgyzia, in Bishkek, in this place called Derdoy. And so you can shop and you can open them up, and they have everything in there, anything you could want, containers full of vacuum cleaners, luggage, refrigerators, stereo equipment, candy, clothing. I mean, anything. And they have section after section after section where there's, 20 containers in a row of various vendors standing there selling various types of furniture, and there's another 20 that is full. The lighting section was freaking incredible, and you could walk 3/4 of a mile and see so many different kinds of lights, and all for so cheap. I wanted to bring a bunch of that stuff home, and what a way to shop! If you bought a house in Bishkek, which was tempting, because you could buy a cool 3-4 bedroom house for $30,000 and surrounded with a complete set of 6-8 foot walls around it, that screen your yard from anybody else. Nice garage, pretty cool place, right? And if you want to live well, take your money from here, go to Bishkek. You can travel from anywhere there and go all over Asia and anywhere else for really, really cheap. And you could live in Bishkek, which is a cool town anyway. The food is fantastic. And the people are great. Of course, I have an advantage because I speak Russian, and most of the people there speak Russian as well. And so when you watch and you see some of these things of what they are doing over there and the trade corridors that they're opening, and then you notice, and I noticed this, this was the year before the BRICS conference, and this is part of the pathway that got me interested in BRICS and in what they were talking, because I spoke to a lot of people over there, and I enjoyed the conversations that I had with some of these small business owners. And they're basically buying these containers and bringing them over, and they sell it all straight out of there, and they're getting cash. And I asked, well, how do you get the containers out of China and get them over here? They said, well, you just go over to China and you buy them. You go to the place where they're actually putting out the lighting. And you go in and you say, oh, just give me a lighting, a container full of various lighting. Send it over here, send it over to Bishkek, and I'll just put it in this Durdoi place, open up the sides, and people will come here. Thousands of people there every day. I just liked wandering around in there. It was fantastic. Anyway, I don't know if that's a good way to do business around here. Clearly it's not. But here, we just buy everything on Amazon. Over there, Amazon is Durdoi. They actually have something called wild berries over there. It's instead of Amazon, it's wild berries, and they have the same sort of concept. But you know what they do different over there? Wild berries actually has stores everywhere. And they're not really stores. All they are shipping centers. So that there you have the shipment come not to your house through FedEx or through the U.S. Postal Service or through UPS. It comes through this Wildberry store. So you order whatever it is you're going to order, a stroller, a refrigerator, a whatever, and it gets delivered to the local Wildberry store. You order it the same way, you pay for it the same way, but you go pick it up at the local Wildberries, and these Wildberries are everywhere. So they're within, walking distance easily of anywhere that you are in a Russian city. You can go to a Wildberries. So it's kind of it's the same thing, only different. And here it's all shipped straight to your house for logistics heavy here, but cheaper over there because you go pick it up yourself. Anyway, I kind of got distracted from where I was going on this small topic of these small and medium enterprises from Russia, but this is how they're going to be sanctions. This is how they get around. It's not necessarily de-dollarization, but they're not paying with a dollar. They're going into China and they're paying with the ruble, or they're paying with the yuan, which they trade the ruble for the yuan, and they do the same thing. And the Russia. Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all the stands over there, including Georgia, everywhere like that, most of them are about between 60 and 90 to 95% of trade is done in the yuan or the ruble, not the dollar. And so these subject matter expert, that's also SME, but this is small and medium enterprises. It's a practical sort of thing. Like I said, there's 500 to 1,000 companies that are going to be there that are tracking all of this. So the core tension of all of this is payments. Russia-China trade hit record territory in 2024. Roughly 1.74 trillion yuan by Chinese customs, and growing in 2025. And especially while U.S. secondary sanctions pressure is spooking major banks. So the reality is that they're building and designing routes around the dollar and around SWIFT banking, and they're building redundant rails so that small and medium enterprises can settle even when the dollar or bigger players or the euro freezes. So Beijing is already pushing this policy, and they've told state firms to prioritize the yuan and overseas businesses, and they're pledging to strengthen their CIPS system. I believe it's called the China International Payment System, I believe is what that means. I can't remember the exact acronym, but I'm pretty sure that's it. And China's interbanking system, cross-border exchanges, and closing and settlement. Western banks are adapting too. HSBC Hong Kong joined China's international bank system as a direct participant last year. Now, that doesn't kill the dollar, but it gives buyers and sellers options when the dollar can't or won't move. And on the Russian side, the shift has been, pretty big. The yuan is now Russia's top foreign currency, and the ruble yuan is the workhorse on the Moscow exchange. By mid-2025, even skeptical Western wires were noting that about 95% of Russia-China trade was being invoiced in the ruble or the yuan. And Moscow's finance ministry actively sells yuan to steady the ruble, and the central bank is running yuan swaps to keep liquidity. It's improvisation, right? But I say, even worse, it's institutionalization. It's institutionalized habit, and the habits are hard to sanction. And by the way, they're not going to come back to the dollar. That ain't happening. And I think China long term is going that way too. So nobody trusts what we do with the dollar. Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. We sanction people. Oh, geez, you can't use our system, and you want to be. And it's going to take a while for it to get there, no doubt. But and it might be slower than I think. But the more they do it, the quicker. The more they push sanctions, the quicker this is going to happen. So let's talk about this. There's a political element to this too. Boris Titov, Moscow's business representative, has been openly talking about Beijing's quiet rollout of digital cross-border swapping as an alternative to SWIFT. Less PR splash, more incremental buildings. China's CIPS, meanwhile, still intersects with SWIFT for messaging in many cases, but Beijing is explicit about scaling it down. Western coverage is admitting the obvious. CIPS is smaller, but it's growing all over the place, and especially in Russia's orbit, mostly because sanctions is forcing that question. That's exactly why forums like this one in Xi'an matter. They translate these alternatives into someone's receivables actually getting paid. So let's look at a bit of a reality check. Chinese exports to Russia have been slipping, and banks are being wary of U.S. penalties. But the split energy imports from Russia have held up even better. And when bank-to-bank transfers jam up, digital and platform settlements have bridged the gap for smaller orders. So the point isn't that the road is smooth, because it's not. The point is that the alternative road exists, and it's getting, rebuilt, if you want to call it that, in the yuan and the ruble, not just dollars or euros. So what exactly are these small and medium enterprises doing? The agenda leans into how to localize products according to international standards, how to create the paperwork to get paid for these proper invoicing, how to use CIPS interchange systems instead of SWIFT, how to find insurance for these overland corridors between places like Dordoy and Shanghai. How do you do that? These dry port briefings teach you how to price rail versus doing it by sea? So what they're showing you is where Chinese agricultural demand is actually headed, and how you can meet specs. Russia media says the aim is even more blunt. How find out means determine how to exit dollar dependence. And that's not just a slogan. I mean, it's procurement. This is how it's going to work. Does this mean the dollar dies? No. It's not. I say that. I try to, hedge the bets on that myself. No friend of Washington's finances hegemony has been clear that the dollar's thrown, it's not going to collapse tomorrow. But the combination of policy nudges, toward Beijing, behavioral shifts from Moscow and others, and logistics hubs and infrastructure, like I've been talking about for months, create a daily alternative that chips away at dollar and Western dominance. Why, if you're going to ship something from China to Moscow and you don't have to go through a shipping port that goes around the globe somewhere, but you can go by rail, why would you pay that in dollars? You just wouldn't. I mean, there's no doubt. It's the Eurasian business continuity and what they are doing in Eurasia, which includes Kazakhstan. Saw a lot of Chinese products all over that place. You pick them. The containers are still rolling and the invoices are still clearing, whether they're and the bulk of them are now being paid in yuan or rubles instead of dollars, or the rupee even. Let's go into India as well. If you're listening from a Western boardroom, the unvarnished takeaway you can take from this is that you might not like any of this, but you don't have to. But in a system where HSBC, one of the largest banks in the world, can sit on the CIPS system as well as the SWIFT system and do both, where the Bank of China is leaning on state firms to settle in the yuan, and where Russia-Chinese trades are already clearing mostly in yuan and ruble, and where India, Russia are exchanging in the rupee or the ruble, the marginal deals that would have defaulted to the dollar in 2019 are now defaulting to the yuan. And these forums don't show up in grand strategy memos. They're showing up in the margins. They're being reported by people like me. And that is how systems change. The habits change. So my prediction, without any hedging, this small and medium enterprise forum is going to lock in dozens, maybe hundreds of mid-sized contracts over the next quarter. And that's not even, hundreds of them. And I'm not talking the next year. And most of which will be settled directly in the yuan. A lot of it's going to be boring: hoses, fittings, seed treatments, HVAC boxes, and for hotels, small items, not huge stuff. Although there could be a lot of EV, electronic vehicle stuff going on. That's possible too. But these small deals are exactly the point. This is how it becomes normal. Watch rail manifests, not press conferences. And when the press conferences do happen, count how many times you hear the word dollar. If that number keeps shrinking, I believe you will know why. And I think it's going to happen. It's this is how it's going to go. Let's see. I think to finish out the show, I have two potential topics. I'm going to switch to the reality of promises, probation, corruption, and NATO talks. Okay, two different versions of NATO talks, and I'm going to shorten it up a little bit because this part was a little bit longer, but I'm not sure I can get through it all. Let me see if I can. Brussels issued its latest progress check on Ukrainian EU hopes, right? And the message is the same song: warm-up words, cold conditions, warm, oh yeah, you will take you, but cold conditions. The commission's praise, then they praise remarkable commitment under wartime pressure, but then underline that what it talks about is non-negotiable. I spoke to you last night about political meddling, protecting independent anti-corruption agencies, or proving that the rule of law isn't just a prop in Ukraine. Sadly, it is. That tone, these are not Kremlin talking points. This is the Commission, the EU Commission, their own language. that they are talking about. Let's talk about this before, the spin. The European Council granted Ukraine candidate status in June of 2022. Negotiations opened in June of 2024. And the first screening wrapped up in September 2025. And now we're in the ritual where Brussels, is going to grade the homework. None of that is in dispute. What is in dispute is whether Kyiv is moving forward or backward on the single issue Brussels cares about the most: anti-corruption enforcement. This summer was a tell. In July of 2025, Ukrainian parliament passed and Zelensky signed legislation tightening executive oversight over NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and SAPO, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. The move generated all kinds of street protests. You remember me reporting about that. And within days, Zelensky pushed a corrective bill to uphold their independence. It was classic Kyiv two-step. First rattle the cage, then promise you're going to, we're just testing, just make it. Brussels did notice, and it went straight into this year's language. The commission literally says, preserve independence of anti-corruption institutes as a top-line to-do list for Ukraine in the coming year. Meanwhile, even parliament members are saying that Ukraine is nothing but corrupt. Western outlets are talking about this report, and they put it plainly. Progress? Sure, despite concerns over corruption. Reuters draft is flagging the commission's reference to negative trends and pressure on agencies. You don't have to be a genius to read the subliminal text here. The EU thinks that Kyiv has been testing how far it can lean on anti-corruption without paying a bill, without paying a price for it. This year's message from the EU is not that far. And the warning isn't just political theater. 2 2025 reviews, integrity, anti-corruption review in May, and then a 5th round follow-up approved in July are just devastating. And they recognize improvements under wartime strain, but drill down on the same stress: agency independence, prosecutorial follow-through, and insulating investigators from political interference, which isn't happening. In other words, the technocrats agree with the headlines. There's a reform frame, but Ukraine isn't following it. It's just not happening. And Kyiv's answer is always familiar. Yeah, we're on track. Zelensky talks about joining the EU before 2030, points to screening that's completed, but he doesn't talk about what they've said here. You need to figure out your corruption, because Ukraine is the most corrupt country on the planet, a lot of people think. And it amplifies the positive lines. He's, of course, talking about the positive lines. That plays well at home. But in Brussels, they're talking about recommendations, not the applause. Preserve independence, expand NABU jurisdiction, introduce robust safeguards against interference and corruption, prevent bypassing the prosecutor's office exclusive power. That's a to-do list that the commission put in black and white, and candidates don't get in by tweeting compliments. They got to tick off those boxes. That's what's got to happen, or they're not going to make it. So from Moscow's point of view, none of this is surprising. From mine either. The EU is talking about membership as motivation and then moves the goalpost through alleged standards. Kyiv chases carrots, Brussels extend the stick. That isn't conspiracy. That's how the club guards itself forever. And the Russian line will be that the West uses the EU dream to keep Ukraine at war, just as NATO promises were used. We're not going to go an inch to the east, and then they were yanked the carpet out from under them. You don't have to accept the whole argument to see how the game plays out, because it is consistent. They're using Ukraine to battle Russia, and that's that. If you need the receipts from what's happening, just, go back and look in the paper. Does this mean that Ukraine is never going to join? No, but it means the price is high because they are losing people. There's, no procedural tricks to, get them in, there's not going to be anything there. These are serious times. I feel like I've been rattling my butt off on this, or flapping my gums here. And the time is a winding down. My name is Samuel Trapp. This is International Flavor. I'm very glad you joined me here today. And I hope you do every night. Tomorrow's the biggest day in radio on Damn Radio. Lots of shows going in, lots of people chatting and giving their points of view on many, many topics. You can listen to all of my shows at internationalflavor.com, or you can go to damnradio.com/podcast and listen to me and everybody else on the station. I appreciate you being here. Have a very good night.
Damn Radio